We've all watched the same YouTube videos talking about how to clean up a muddy mix. And they go something like this. Use an EQ, cut these 3 magic low-mid frequencies, have a fantastic day. All of this is a great tactic to address the tonal balance in our mixes. We all know that 200 hertz sounds muddy and we can just cut it with the EQ. That is using what I call a Tylenol approach. That is popping a pill after you found out you have a symptom or an issue and then not really addressing the root cause. So today, I want to talk about what are the underlying principles. What are the root causes and problem areas that are causing muddiness to show up in our mixes in the first place? Because muddiness is not a character running around that just magically shows up. This is actually caused by things and sources within our mix, in our sound system, and in our room, and the musicians. So I want to unpack that and say, how can we move farther upstream and not just wait for the problem of muddiness to show up and attack it with the EQ? How can we use our system design choices, how we coach our musicians, how we place our monitors to make sure that muddiness never shows up in our mixes to begin with. And if it's there, it's going to be less and we know what to do with it. Before we jump in, I don't want to dog on EQ too much here because it really is one of your most powerful tools. We've been using that word muddy to talk about what in my mind is 200 hertz. That is one of the pivot points I have in my 9 EQ pivot points guide. So if EQ is a little bit confusing to you, you know you can boost or cut frequencies at a certain width or make it narrow. You know how it works, but how can you start to use it and hear problems in advance and use EQ to work for you? So the thing is, EQs measure sound. They need to know the frequency, the gain, and the Q, and you need to talk to an EQ in its own language. But the thing is, we as humans, we describe sound. It was only first I talked about muddiness. I said, hey, yeah, that lives around 200 hertz. So we got to translate that to our EQ. So this guide picks out 9 different frequencies that'll give 2 adjectives each so that you can translate and use the words you already use to describe sound, then to give you actionable data on what frequencies to boost or cut. It gives you use cases for all of it, some reference tracks you can use to hear a specific range. You can get that at producedbymkc.com/audio toolkit or go to the link below. The audio toolkit has a ton of great tools in there. The 9 EQ pivot points is just one, so make sure and check all those out. Okay, here are the 4 main problem areas that actually cause muddy mixes and how can we prevent it from creeping into our mixes. The first is our sound system itself. So speakers become less directional the lower in frequency we go. That's why if you are at a stoplight and you hear all these subs rattling because someone thought it was cool to throw 12-inch kickers in the back of their truck and crank them all up, low frequencies can easily diffract and go around hard surfaces, big surfaces, and the smaller the wavelength or the higher in frequency, it's going to be easily stopped. So that's why speakers, when you see I've got a 90-degree speaker like a QSC CP8 or something like that, it can direct basically 1K-ish and up in a 90-degree pattern, but the lower you go in frequency, the more it's going to balloon out and basically move omnidirectional. By the time you get to 63 hertz or something like that, it's almost a perfect circle, right? And so we can do certain tricks, whether it's putting boxes in a line array or doing a fancy sub thing to help steer the energy. But if you just got a left and a right flown single box speaker, that low end is just going to fly off the back. And the thing is, since our mains are hung on the stage and our musicians are on the stage, those low frequencies have a very short path and can leak back into your microphones. This is also a recipe for feedback, right? So that's also true with your floor wedges. You have sound coming back from the monitor into your microphone. If you have too much of a single frequency, you can start to feed back. So why is this muddiness and not just a copy of the original? Since the high frequencies do go forward and don't go back around the box in your microphone, you are getting a pink shifted, or basically pretend you have a low pass filter at 1K and taking out all the high end, and it's coming back and combining with the original signal, causing a comb filter and increasing the energy just in the low end, which contributes to mud. And this is also true with our subsystems. Most of the time we throw them in a left-right stack and call it a day. We're going to have all sorts of comb filtering and power alleys and power valleys. I've got another video on that specifically on my channel. You should check it out. So, but the thing is, right in the middle of our stage, where we place the lead vocalist is going to be the strongest power alley from a left-right sub. So we have them there. If our subs reach up to 100 hertz and start to dive off, every time the kick drum hits, that punch is going to come right into your vocal microphone. You can say like, well, yeah, I'm high passing it. But even then, if you're using a gentle high pass filter, even 12 dB per octave, you're still going to get a bunch of low end creeping up and creating mud in your mixes. So that's coming from your mains, your monitors, and your subs, because again, they're not that directional. The lower you go in frequency, it's going to spill back and diffract around the boxes and spill into your microphone. So second place is the room itself. And this is usually from no room treatment or very poor room treatment. I usually mix in rooms that aren't treated that great, at least here where I live. There are very few that actually have a lot of treatment up. And there are some venues that are these really fantastic halls that look super, super cool, but they're glass and concrete and wood, so they're very reflective. So the same is true, just like a speaker isn't very directional, except in the high frequencies. We can have energy bouncing against a wall. You can see all these sound panels kill a lot of it, but this is why I have thick sound panels. You need a lot of sound damping to capture the full range signal, right? So if it's hitting a wall or even like a thin panel, some of the top end is getting absorbed, but not the low end. So we still have all this low end still is bouncing around the room, right? And so people put up sound damping, but it's actually only taking care of, again, 1 or 2K and up if you have a thin panel, and there's this low end swimming. So all this is going to do what's called regen or regenerate back in your microphones, causing muddiness again. So we have the speakers themselves, the true source, the speakers hitting the wall, bouncing around and coming back into your microphones. That is our second source of muddiness in the room. And another point under that is we also have room modes. And so depending on where you're standing out in the room and the length or the wavelength of a given sound coming from your speaker bouncing back and forth in the wall, you can have hot spots and dead spots, really similar to power alleys and power valleys. But this is an acoustic phenomenon from two surfaces and their wavelengths matching up, not from two sources interacting with each other. So if we have a hot spot of a room mode also coming up, this is going to be the lower you go in frequency, let's say 200 hertz and below, is where these room modes are going to be really, really pronounced. Okay, so we have the speakers, the poor sound damping, room modes because of that poor sound damping, not just the reflections. And that's all that is going to be spectrally tilted downward to have more low end than top end, because high end is going to be much more easily absorbed. Okay, so third point is our musicians themselves. If a vocalist is doing us a favor and actually singing into the microphone and having it close to the mouth, that's great. But if they get super close to it, we've all heard this really woofy, boomy sound that people doing movie trailers really want to keep up, and that's the proximity effect. So that, I think Shure has a really great graph online saying like, okay, here's an SM58. If you're this far away, then if you're this far away and this far away, and it tilts up, we get this increase in bass. So you can also have your vocalist, just from the way they're singing into the microphone, hype up the bass in the microphone. A second from our musicians standpoint is if I've run sound for some dad rock bands, and you know what I mean by that. They're just playing a bunch of old Skinner tunes and using cowboy chords and just chugging through them. They're all usually running in a lane. They're not really playing with each other, knowing how am I fitting. They're all just like doing the chord chart and playing their own thing. And so a lot of times they're using their voicings or the way they're playing, and they're stepping on each other. They're not trying to arrange it and use the full range and the whole box they have. They're all sitting in the same frequency space. And what is that? If I pick up my guitar, if I do this G right here, this bottom G is, I think 100 hertz, and the next octave up there is 200. This kind of low mid-range, they're usually hammering really hard, and that's going to stack up. So it's the left hand on the piano, the low end on the guitar. They're all hammering this like 100, 200, 400 octave and having this built up. They all be rhythm players. You're not having someone that's staying up high, someone stand low. They're usually hammering the rhythm parts, which is going to have this build up of frequency in the first place. Again, they're also making their patches or their sounds in a vacuum. A lot of musicians practice in a distributed fashion, then get together as a band for the show. So they're in their bedroom or studio, much like I am, and they're arranging and making their keyboard patches or their guitar patches in a vacuum. They're not hearing them in context with the rest of the band, and most of them want to sound good and full on their own. So most of them have too much low end. They want to be able to support themselves. But in a mix, it usually needs to be the left-hand keyboardist, secondarily and primarily a bass player that is supporting the whole band. So I'm not shy in cutting out low end on guitars or other counterpoint instruments because they don't need to be carrying the weight of the full band if you have that many players. And then lastly, similarly to our speakers leaking in our microphones, musicians' amps can do that too. And even if they try to do you a favor and turn them around and point them at the wall, you're still getting all this low mid information coming off the back of the amps into your room, which you can't control. So you have this uncontrolled low mid heavy source from an amp coming in straight off the stage into your room, and that introduces more mightiness. So our fourth area is how we're mixing in general. So I usually start with all my channels, the EQ flat, then make adjustments, but I have my high pass filter set at a good starting point depending on the instrument. So for vocals, that's 140 hertz for me, and I'll adjust it if they're eating the mic or not very far, or if they just have a lot of stage noise, need to get rid of low end, I'll go ahead and roll that up. But a lot of engineers will leave that high pass filter lower at 80 hertz or something like that. And that's leaving a lot of room for low end to come in the microphone. So I think a high pass filter is one of the most powerful tools to start creeping up and get rid of low end that's really not needed in your sources so you can start stacking up the arrangement. And lastly, as far as our problem areas, is we do sound checks in a vacuum. We do them one instrument at a time. Okay, give me the kick, give me the snare, give me the toms, overheads. Now let's do bass. Now let's do keys. And then we spend forever tweaking in a vacuum. And then we have 30 seconds for them to play a full song, kind of get some faders, and then it's time to wait for the show. So we spent the 80% of our time getting individual sources tweaked right by themselves, and then only spend 20% of it actually hearing what everything's going to sound like in context with a real song. So I would ask you to flip that. We're going to talk about those solutions here in a little bit. So you see that problem though? We're spending too much time with individual instruments, making sure they all sound great in their own, and not spending enough time how they are in the full mix. Okay, I just gave you an angry rant of all these different places that it comes from. Now I want to offer some solutions, okay? For each of these four buckets, we're going to go back through your sound system, your room, how to coach musicians, and then how to mix. So first off, with your sound system, in your tuning, use a 2-channel audio analyzer and see how a familiar system is behaving. So I used to tune sound systems this way. I would just throw up a reference mic that I got, run it through an RTA, see if the pink noise looked kind of flat, do some EQ and call it a day. But the thing is, with a single channel analyzer not actually having a transfer function, you have no idea if these peaks and valleys are from the room or from the speaker, from an EQ you forgot to bypass. Can't trace the root issue of what's going on. So use a 2-channel analyzer and see if you're getting good data. So I ran a sound for a show that was in this big giant concrete and wood hall, and I was having a 2-channel analyzer to be able to hear the room was fantastic because I got to put the speakers at a decent height, but because the room was so live, I actually had to end up using a low shelf from 1K and below and cut out a lot of low end in that speaker to make it more intelligible. So don't be afraid to do that, to rein back the entire system's low end balance so that you can be account for what's going on in the room. Again, this is a last step. You make sure your placement is there and your sources sound good. But if the room is really having a heavy tonal coloration of what's going on in your room, then don't be afraid to use EQ on the low end to bring that back. One way you can test this is you could put one microphone on stage where your presenter might be, then one out in the room where your average listener might be, so in the middle of the audience. Run pink noise and then compare the two traces. Are you getting a lot of low end bleed on stage from your system? Is the high end should be much different from the audience microphone than what's on stage. But if you're getting a ton of low end bleed, see if you have a more directional speaker, if you got a line array versus a single one. It's usually hard to adjust on the fly that way, but you can at least compare from those two spots. Oh, I am getting a lot of low end spill, or the room acoustics are really having a long decay time for those low frequencies and they're hanging around. So yeah, make sure and measure the low end at multiple places though before you start hacking away. So maybe try the front row, the middle of the audience, and the back of the audience as 3 great microphone positions before you start using EQ and hacking away. The third solution here would be to use directional subarrays. I've got 2 videos on how to do an inline gradient cardioid and an inverted gradient stack cardioid subarray. So keeping low end off the stage is really helpful for not having this low end mess swimming and increasing the muddiness in your mix. And that walks you through step by step how to design and deploy those. Again, a cardioid subarray has like a cardioid shape on a microphone, so we have less low end on stage than we do going out into the audience. And last thing under your sound system design that's going to really help is be really precise with your monitor placement. I see a lot of engineers place their monitors on the stage and have the microphone really butted up against the floor monitor. So when someone's standing 5.5 feet tall, their head is way out of the coverage pattern. It's too far forward or upstage. So you actually need to pull the stand back and see the center of the speaker cone needs to be pointed right at their face so they have the most amount of high end, because usually it's not a volume thing for most people if they can't hear themselves in the monitor. It's a total balance. So they're hearing themselves heavily pink shifted. So you need more and more gas. So this is just shooting more and more low mids in your microphone versus having a cleaner, more direct signal of the monitor pointed right at them. Okay, our second category solutions for our room. Actually treat the room if that's within your control. That means hiring an acoustician and getting sound panels that aren't just an inch thick or hanging up some curtains and calling it a day. This requires some real forethought into what's actually going to happen in your venue. So if that's not within your control, what you can do though is as you mix, walk around the room and get to know what different spots are going to sound like. What does it sound like at the bar versus the front row versus the side? If it's really inconsistent, there may not be that much within your control, but you can at least make a mental map of where people are standing and know like, hey, I thought this 75-degree speaker was really going to cover well and get off to the sides, but it's not because I couldn't get the trim height that I wanted. So know that, hey, at these particular seats, I really need to go and listen to make sure that the main speaker is intelligible at those spots. Okay, thirdly, your musicians, how you can coach them and provide solutions there. So first is to pay attention to the arrangement. So know what instruments need to be out front at what time, what instruments are support roles, and so you can know how you need to fit them together. A great band is going to do that for you. They're going to play in a way that puts them in a position to be in a support role, maybe just doing block chords on keys and then a guitar solo. But if everyone's just running in their own lanes, just doing cowboy chords and strumming away, you're going to have to force the arrangement yourself by putting some instruments lower, and whatever you think the lead instrument at that time is pushing it there. And I'd also communicate with the band. You don't have to guess, just ask. How are they stacking the vocals? If you see 3 vocal microphones on the right ear and they just sound check, like, hi, I'm Janet, hi, I'm Bill, hi, I'm Susan, whatever. Ask them how the vocals are stacked. Or, hey, are you doing lead? Or are you doing harmony? Are you trading off songs? So get that information ahead of time so you're not having to guess like who is going to be leading what song, how they're stacking harmonies. Same thing if you got 2 guitar players. Hey, are you doing mostly rhythm and you're mostly lead? Or are you switching off? Asking these questions ahead of time to wrap your brain around the arrangement will make sure that you're not overlapping in these areas. And last would be to coach on mic technique when you need to. It's one thing to cross your arms in the back and be like, man, they just keep eating my microphone. It's so woofy. Or if they're doing the opposite, they're holding it way down. You have to crank up the monitor volume and getting low mids feeding back. Coach them. Sometimes they just new and don't know what to do. So have that conversation, open it up. And lastly, kind of a problem solution with musicians would be that knowing that most instruments are going to overlap to some degree in the 200 to 500 hertz range. Even a violin, its lowest string is a G, and that's 200 hertz. So that's right in our muddiness. So we think of it as a high instrument, but if it's doing down low, it's really hammering home right there. And even a bass guitar, we think of it as a low instrument. That low E is 41 hertz, but if they move up to the A string and then the D string, that's 140 hertz, and the open G, the next highest one, is 200 hertz. So knowing what instruments are going to primarily dominate each range and how they're playing will help you determine which one's going to lose and get the low end cut out of it so it can stand apart from the rest. And those kind of bleeds over into music theory world, but don't be afraid if an instrument is not running in the lane it's supposed to use EQ to shape it and pull it out into a different area. Okay? So lastly, we're moving into our mix territory. I guess we got there a little bit. Is I really love a tool called Tonal Balance Control by Isotope. They make studio plugins, but I usually can run the stereo out of my mix if I'm mixing on something like an X32 or a CO5 over the USB card or Dante Virtual Sound Card into my computer. Now I can listen, open up my DAW that I use and run that plugin there and monitor my mix. And so Tonal Balance Control gives me a set, almost like target curves that look great. So I know that the sound system, my room, especially if it's unfamiliar to me, I could be hearing it and saying like, hey, this sounds really balanced. But I know before my mix ever hits those set of variables, I can run it to Tonal Balance Control. And if it's running within that set boundary, I know I'm in good shape. I also like to use reference tracks as I'm tuning so I can hear what's going on. So if I had time to sound check and got them to run one song, I'll record it locally to the USB stick, then compare it against a reference track. And if it feels really dark, I can make changes there before they hit the first note. Third is to make line check quick, so you can do a sound check with a full mix faster. So again, I'm separating line check from sound check. Line check, you in an A2 or you by yourself with an iPad on stage, just make sure you can get and hear signal from each instrument. And then you can move on to when the musician's actually there playing, make sure, use only 5 or 10 seconds to get the level right and then set a high pass filter and then move on. You need to hear how they're sounding in the full mix in order to make informed decisions. And then number 4 is you use a 2-channel analyzer as a guide as you go along. So if you want to get real fancy, you can use Open Sound Meter or Smart, run your mix in as the measurement channel, run your mix in as the reference channel directly from the board, then have a microphone right next to you as your measurement channel. You can compare the two. And if your measurement channel is heavily pink shifted versus your so it has a lot of low end and not a lot of top end versus your measurement of your raw mix, then something in the room or in the system is tilting that up, and you can address it accordingly by adjusting microphone placement, the tuning of the room, or placement of your speakers. Okay, that was a lot of information. Let's recap and look at the key takeaways. So be intentional with the speakers you choose and where you place them and where you aim them. I say this is the biggest win because a lot of times you don't have control over the room, and we just need to know, like, hey, where can I put speakers that's going to cover the audience well and not have too much leakage on stage. And number 2 is EQ can't fix physics. It cannot fix a comb filter. A comb filter is a result of a time problem, not a tonal balance problem. Okay, so know what is the true root issue of having a bunch of low mids in your microphones. And number 3 is your room has a lot to do with it. You cannot escape a room or venue that you're in. If you don't have a lot of time to get out your tuning rig and do a lot of measurements, at least listen to a reference track like, hey, it sounds pretty boomy or muddy for whatever reason. And a room also includes maybe a speaker system that you're not familiar with. So again, any one of those variables could be adding up to what sounds muddy to you, but don't just go to the source directly and start cutting there. So what I would love for you to let me know below is which one of these 4 areas plague the muddiness in your mix the most. Do you feel uncomfortable mixing? Do you feel like musicians are just giving you bad sounds? Or do you just have a bunch of terrible venues in your neck of the woods? Or are you really uncomfortable with sound system deployment? So don't forget to snag my 9 EQ pivot points guide. I'm really excited to share that with you. Again, that's just one of the pivot points is muddy at 200 hertz. Download that at producedbymkc.com/audio toolkit or go to the link below. I'm Michael. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this cleared up some muddiness for you. I'll catch you on another video.